If you struggle with laziness, you need to stop. Laziness is a form of evil, and in this video, I will explain it to you and hopefully terrify you into not being lazy anymore. So, for starters, this notion that laziness is a component of evil or that laziness is evil, not my original idea, actually came from one of the most impactful books that I ever read, still to this day, one of my favorite books. I think I've read it 3 times, and it's called People of the Lie by Scott Peck, and the full title is People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil. And in it, and I've talked about Scott Peck in some of my other videos, in particular 2 books, The Road Less Traveled and People of the Lie, both of which had a huge impact on me. But in this one, The Hope for Healing, or People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil, what Dr. Peck does, and Dr. Peck is a clinical psychiatrist, he's actually a medical doctor, but he was also at one point studying to be a Jesuit priest in the Catholic Church. So he kind of has this combination of spirituality and medical objectivity. And so in this book, he basically uses his experience as a clinical psychiatrist to try to extract sort of an objective definition of human evil, because his postulate is that medicine, part of the practice of good medicine is objectivity. In other words, we don't moralize. There's no value for a doctor in moralizing about diabetes or moralizing about cancer or judging or shaming hypertension or something, right? They have to objectively quantify it and treat it as a set of phenomenon related to different things occurring inside of the body and treat it pathologically, just treat it objectively, right? That's science. Essentially, medicine is a form of science. So what he does is he tries to take a doctor's medical/scientific approach to the question of human evil, which normally gets wrapped up in very moralistic language and judgments. And his point is basically that it's unproductive. We can hate it, we can be angry about it, we can demonize it, we can talk bad about it being evil, but at the end of the day, if we want to heal it, we need to actually become objective and approach it medically or scientifically. And that's what the book does. It's so fascinating. To me, the most fascinating parts of the book are where he's finding evil, he's extracting evil and kind of defining or creating a framework around evil based on just very sort of low-level, prosaic activities of fairly ordinary human lives. And it's just the ordinary, the presence of evil in the ongoing behavior of just ordinary adults, and I suppose maybe some children, that is actually the most terrifying thing about it, is how sort of insidious and subtle. It's like the line in The Usual Suspects, where the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he doesn't exist. It's when it's right there out in the open happening in front of us even in situations where it's not illegal, so nobody's getting punished for it, but it's just right there. That's the evil that we can learn so much from, and that if we're willing to be reflective and really, really willing to look at it, can instruct our lives. But the reason I'm saying all this in a video here that's about laziness is the 2 primary components. In fact, the 2 essential, absolute components of all human evil are narcissism, a self-love, a kind of a romantic adoration of self, where we place ourselves and our needs above the needs of others, the way we might a cherished loved one. Like it's okay to love someone else like that, but you probably don't want to love yourself like that, right? And then it's narcissism and it's laziness. Laziness, evil cannot happen without laziness. Every manifestation of human evil is at some level taking the easy way. It's doing the thing that's easier, which is to shift our blame or our judgment or our hostility or our hurt onto others, than to do the harder thing, which is to look at it or point it at ourselves. So all evil is lazy. Therefore, maybe this doesn't hold up in like classic logic, but if you read the book, it makes sense. All laziness is an expression of the same tendencies that can ultimately result in evil. And this, I actually believe, is why a lot of people that struggle with what presents as laziness, and it can have different causation, but the reason a lot of people never break out of ruts of that are sort of generally defined as like, I know that I should be doing a thing, but instead I keep not doing the thing or doing a different thing. Any of these sort of ongoing perpetual ruts in our life, I think the reason a lot of people don't break out of them is because they don't actually scrutinize the principles or the precepts that they are submitting to in that behavior. Everything that we do is submission to some idea. There is nothing that we do as human beings that is not about submitting to a precept and a precept is just an idea that suggests certain actions or behaviors, kind of like a guiding principle in life. That's what a precept is. So everything we do is based on submission to a precept. There are no actions that are taken by humans that are unintentional. Now, they might not be conscious. It might be driven by our subconscious. In fact, the vast majority of what we do is driven by our subconscious. I think only 1 out of every 400,000 thoughts is actually a conscious thought. So the vast majority of what we think is subconscious, and the vast majority of what we do is driven by subconscious, but it's all intentional, right? And it's all intentional based on our experience in the world of exposing ourselves to different ideas and principles and philosophies and notions of what's right or wrong or good or bad or self-serving versus, self-sacrificing. And we're constantly making judgments about what we should do and what we do, and it's all based on submission to precepts. So I think the reason that a lot of people's lives don't change is because they get really fixated on the behavior that they're trying to change, and maybe they struggle with it and get frustrated about it and kind of feel like they're beating their head against the wall, but they aren't looking at the actual precepts to which they're submitting in that behavior. And when we put that lens on, when we actually put our first principles, precept scanner lens on and look at our own behaviors, that's when laziness gets really, really scary. What I've done here is I've made a little list of some of the precepts that we are submitting ourselves to whenever we're being lazy. Precept number 1, it is better to feel good right now, even if I feel worse later. Whenever we are lazy, we are submitting ourselves to that precept. Precept number 2, having high standards is not always important. It may be important some of the time, but it's clearly not always important to hold myself to a high standard because I'm going to just be lazy right now and not do it, right? Precept number 3, it's okay to avoid something because it's difficult. Or it's even perhaps preferred sometimes to avoid something because it's difficult. I'm being lazy right now because I'm not doing the more difficult thing. Instead, I'm choosing to do the easier thing, right? So that's precept number 3. Precept number 4, this one's dark. This one's really dark. My values change because I'm tired. In other words, what I should do is different based on how much energy I have, right? So right now, my energy's kind of low, I'm tired, it's been a long day, so I know I should do the thing, but philosophically, I'm submitting to the precept that my energy level creates some kind of, quantum morality in the world where it changes when it's applied to what I should do, and therefore, what I should do is different because I'm tired, right? See how kind of devious that is? That is precept number 4. And precept number 5 is that my spare time exists for my enjoyment or for me to be in service to me, that is why I'm given spare time. So whether it's spare time that just sort of naturally occurred in my schedule or it's spare time that I created via a lazy choice some other way, like, I'm not going to go into work today because I'm not feeling it, and therefore I've now created spare time for myself. This spare time that I have, the highest and best use for it is for me to indulge myself, me to take care of myself, me to be in service to myself. That's obviously a precept that we're submitting ourselves to when we choose to use our spare time, being lazy, which serves no one other than our immediate gratification. Precept number 6 that we submit ourselves to when we choose to be lazy is that my natural gifts do not come with a responsibility to actually use them. So everybody has some sort of gift or ability or talent or interest or skill or just energy that they're able to apply to things, better or worse than others or even relative to themselves. Like you know what I mean, right? We have things that we naturally kind of tend to be better at, right? Those are gifts. Those are gifts that we were endowed with somehow through some creative process. And if I believe that those gifts don't have any responsibility, so I can, at any given time, like there's nothing wrong with me saying, yeah, I'm not going to use them. I'm not going to use them to serve humanity. I'm not going to use them to create beauty in the world. I'm not going to use them to just, leave an indelible mark in the world. I'm just going to neglect them temporarily. That's okay, right? When we're lazy, we submit ourselves to this notion that my natural gifts don't carry any responsibility for me to actually be using them at any given moment in time when I could be, because it's my spare time. And then the final, or the seventh on my list, final precept on my list that we are submitting ourselves to when we choose to be lazy, it's kind of the overarching one that's the most concerning of all, is basically that it's okay to do what comes naturally. That what in psychology we might call our id, or our basic instinct, or our animal instinct, or our animal nature, our Darwinian nature, whatever it is, there's no responsibility or necessity for me as a human being to transcend that nature, and that it is okay to just settle for and do what comes naturally. That is really the core precept that we submit ourselves to when we decide to be lazy. So there's a saying that's very common in personal development circles that says, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And the reason is because human beings are very ideologically consistent. Now, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily predictable. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily easy to decipher, or that even our consistency is necessarily obvious. But at some deep level, and again, this goes to the subconscious, which is making 399,999 thoughts and decisions out of every 400,000. We are ideologically extremely consistent beings. There are things that we believe at a deep level that every single thing in our life lines up with. I have a friend named Dov Barron, who's a pretty well-known speaker and influencer and author, and he calls it your red thread. It's the red thread that is woven through the entire tapestry of your life, and that you can pull on, and it'll pull out every single thing you've ever said, everything you've ever thought, everything you've ever done will all be consistent with this ideological red thread that was probably set in place when you were a kid, usually between 8 and 10 years old. They say is when kind of your core beliefs about the world start to crystallize. And so this idea that how we do one thing is how we do everything is anchored in these core beliefs, right? Our cognitive linchpins that allow us to decipher and make sense of the world. And you can see this is why people repeat patterns in relationships. It's why people have the same struggles with their body or their work, or with anger issues, or these things. It's like wherever you go, there you are, right? These things creep up again and again and again in our lives because they're rooted in these deep subconscious beliefs that we typically don't look at. Like I said again, we typically aren't looking at our behaviors and trying to go deeper down to the core precepts that we're submitting ourselves to all the time. But when you understand this, you realize you can't be lazy without submitting yourselves to these ideas, these precepts, right? These principles. And if you're tolerant or willing or even enthusiastic about or at least subconsciously driven towards submission to these ideas in one area of your life, they're in there. Those flies are in the ointment, and they're not only in the ointment about this, but not that. They're in there. They're in your mind. You have submitted yourself. If you are a person that is consistently lazy, then you have submitted yourself to all of these precepts. That it's better to feel good now, even if I feel worse later. It's my natural gifts that have no responsibility for me to be using them at any given time. My spare time exists solely in service to myself or for my own enjoyment. It is totally fine to not do things because they are hard in exchange for doing things that are easy. High standards, completely optional. I don't need to have them all the time. And especially that it's totally fine to just do what comes naturally. If you're lazy, you've said yes to those ideas. What other actions or behaviors could we justify simply having said yes to those same precepts? Cheating? Yeah, I could use all those same ideas to argue the advantages of cheating. Stealing? Ditto. I could use those precepts to all validate and justify stealing. What about rape? Do it. Do it as a thought experiment. Go back and rewatch this video and see if you could use all 7 of those precepts to justify rape. What about murder? Could you justify murder? You could. And you've already said yes. You've said yes to all these underlying ideas that you could use to justify theft or rape or murder. See what I mean? It's a slippery slope. Now, maybe you wouldn't because, well, you're not emotionally charged enough to be willing to, exert the effort, or you're not willing to deal with potential legal consequences, or you're not willing to deal with, the shame or the ignominy of violating the social contract and the other, consequences or fallout of these choices. But in the right moment, if push came to shove, if you were emotionally charged enough and you actually thought you could get away with it, and you have patterned yourself and conditioned yourself to saying yes to these precepts through a consistent pattern of laziness, that could manifest as rape or murder in a moment. If the others, if other things lined up to make it something that wasn't a self-annihilating choice in that moment. That's why it's such a slippery slope. If we don't get to the core of what drives our most destructive and shameful behaviors, can become gateways to even more destructive and shameful behaviors based on how our life circumstances evolve. It is extremely important what you say yes to ideologically and how that shows up, even if it's in parts of your life that, they're not illegal, they're not hurting anything, it's my choice, it's a free country. That's not a reason to justify saying yes and submitting to precepts that have ultimately evil implications and dire consequences. And here's where it gets really, really scary, is when you are going through life with an energy that says, okay, here are the ideas that I've said yes to, and by extension, here are the ideas that I've said no to, which would be the inverse of a lot of those precepts. Things like, I should always have high standards. My gifts carry with them an obligation to use them in service to humanity whenever I can. Or that it is not okay to just do what comes naturally. I need to constantly be pushing myself to transcend or rise above my natural instinct. I need to be striving for superego, not for id, right? Like, these are the inverse precepts that if we submitted ourselves to, we would be absolutely disgusted by the idea of being lazy. But if we've gone through life and we've conditioned ourselves to say yes to these ideas, and we're carrying or projecting an energy that says, hey, I'm in alignment with these ideas, what are we going to attract in life? We're going to naturally attract other people that are also submitting to those same precepts, right? Like attracts like. We're going to naturally resonate with and attract other lazy people into our life, other people that have said yes to those same precepts. Well, what happens when that happens? Now your environment is starting to change. Now your environment is starting to evolve. And what happens as your environment changes? It means the consequences of your behaviors change. So if you are the only lazy person in an environment of really, really driven, motivated people who have high standards, high ethics, high morals, and that was your environment, you're going to be less likely, obviously, to transgress in certain ways because of the judgment and the environmental resistance that you're going to face. So now you've aligned yourself and changed your environment into an environment populated with people who are also ideologically lazy, and they've also submitted to these negative ideas. Well, now the consequences change. Now you're not getting people propping you up or checking you or reinforcing your better nature. They're actually making it easier for you to acquiesce to your nature or to your lesser nature, because when you do that, you validate their acquiescence and vice versa, right? So heck, now you might be surrounded by people where you could murder someone and they're not even going to care because they don't even think anything's wrong with it because of what they've said yes to, right? So you can see how this is just, you can create this like vortex in your life. And I'm being a little bit, extreme and kind of histrionic by like tying it to murder. I'm not saying most lazy people are likely to commit murder, but I guarantee you that lazy people are more likely to commit murder because murder is almost always taking an easy way out, and lazy people are giving themselves the easy way out every single freaking day. So it's going to be more natural for them, right? Like you can take these ideas have consequences, and you can take them and you can say, well, if I didn't live in my, pretty little white picket fence American dream life, and I was suddenly thrust into an environment where there was less rule of law and there were more big ethical questions happening all the time, and I was in a completely different world. Maybe I lived in some remote part of Africa where it's completely lawless and tribal, who would I be in that world? Who would you be in that world? Really? If you're lazy here, you could be an absolute monster there. So I'll tell you a brief story about when it hit me like a punch in the face that I have been indulging some lazy tendencies and I have got to stop. I had read this book, People of the Lie, and I had been deeply convicted, but I was still kind of going through the motions and I hadn't really shifted my life in response to this feeling of conviction and what I ultimately knew was right. And then I was playing a gig, I used to be a professional piano player, and I was playing at the home of a guy named Lester Smith. You can Google him. He actually has a really short Wikipedia entry and a bunch of articles that were written about him in the Houston Chronicle. He was a really, really kind of iconic figure in Houston, Texas, where I grew up and where I was a piano player. And Lester was what's known as a wildcatter. And it was kind of this older generation of people that would go out into, West Texas. That's the Texas Wildcatters. It was usually West Texas. They go out in West Texas where they thought there was going to be oil. Maybe they had a, geologist buddy or something. Or for some reason, they thought there was going to be oil. And they would buy up ground. They would buy up land or they would buy up mineral rights. And they would, go raise the money and basically just drill exploratory wells. And it was like real wild, wild west kind of stuff. You've got people just like drilling wells in the desert. But if one of them hits, T. Boone Pickens was a wildcatter. Another guy I played piano for. He was a billionaire. Lester Smith, I don't actually know how much money Lester Smith had. I would guess he wasn't a billionaire, but I would guess he might have had like, $500 million, maybe $300 to $500 million. I know that when he died, he had personally donated over $150 million to charity. So, we're talking about a really, really wealthy, successful guy. And he was old school, man. He was a wildcatter. He was dusty and gritty, and he would get the work done himself, probably better than anybody he could have hired to do it. He was just a pretty tough, gritty guy. But when I played for him, he was older. He was obviously very wealthy, but he still had that kind of really rugged element. And he was, when I played for him, he was probably in his 50s, and his wife was maybe in her 30s. So he had a younger wife, and he really would he kept up with her though, energetically, he was right there with. They were actually professional ballroom dancers. He built a legitimate professional sized ballroom in his own house so that he could practice dancing with his wife. This guy was a serious badass. But all the musicians that I knew in town, they hated him. Nobody liked playing gigs at his house because he had such high standards. And you would be loafing, or you would be late coming back from a break, or even if the music was kind of sloppy, maybe somebody had a few too many drinks, he would be on you. He would call you on it. He would report back to the booking agent, and you would never get hired to play at his house again. He was just a guy that the way he did one thing was the way he did everything. And I remember being on a gig when Lester, who everybody had told me, this guy's such an asshole, right? And he called us out because we were late coming back from a break. And he was pretty brutal. And I remember thinking, screw this guy, he's such an asshole, man, they were right, this guy's a jerk. And I just had all this sort of antipathy welling up inside me, and I was really indignant, and he doesn't understand. Who is this rich guy to try to understand what it's like to be me when, I struggle and I play music and I'm poor, even though it was all my own choices, right? And I remember after that gig, really I was so mad. I was having a really visceral reaction, and I remember thinking why am I still so pissed? Why am I carrying this? And I realized it's because Lester just showed me. He just made real in a moment this conviction that I've been carrying since I read that book. I'm fucking lazy. I'm lazy. I'm a lazy MFer. And I can't hide from it because I knew that it was time to be back on the bandstand. I knew that we were getting paid. I knew that, these guys were trading their money for our time based on a contract that we signed, based on terms that we agreed to, and we didn't hold up our end of the bargain. And yet we sat there in our entitlement, in our indignation, thinking, instead of looking at ourselves while he was letting us have it for being late, thinking about what a jerk he is. What a jerk he is, because he just wanted to actually get what he paid for and what we committed to give in exchange for what he paid. Maybe this isn't about him. Maybe this is about me. Maybe I should have, when the we were supposed to be back on in 5 minutes. Maybe I should have rounded up the guys and said, hey, we got to be back on in 5 minutes. Put your cigarettes out and quit, doing whatever you're doing, and let's go get back on stage, right? That's on me. And that was the moment when I realized, because I had all these stories in my head about like, well, yeah, I'm not as bad as the other one. I'm not as bad as that guy. I'm not in my car getting high on the brakes, right? I had all these stories. There was only one story, and that was Lester had higher standards than me, and I was lazy, and I knew that laziness was a facet of evil because I had read this book and I agreed with it, and I was doubling down on my laziness by now that I knew still being too lazy to change. After that happened, after that gig, I remember thinking, okay, I can't be lazy anymore. How do I get unlazy? And I started researching, motivation, inspiration, human energy, drive, willpower. I started reading books like, The Power of Habit, and just books focused around how to change how you show up in the world, right? And I basically developed a methodology that said, okay, if laziness, and I looked at my life and I said, why is it that I'm lazy? Or what is the rationalization? Or what is the set of mental steps that I go through in order to be lazy in a moment? And it's usually related to tired. I'm tired, I'm worn out, it's been a long day, or, it's just kind of giving myself a pass, right? Like I was, I'm typically pretty on it when I wake up in the morning. I like to go after it and get it. But my gigs were always at night, and I was always giving myself a pass to be lazy because I say that I was tired. So I thought, all right, if for me, laziness correlates to energy, then what I need to do is I need to actually find ways to feel more energized. Eventually, I'll probably, through discipline and repetition, be able to get into the groove of not being lazy purely on the basis of principles and purely on the basis of right living. But for now, while I'm trying to shift the inertia, I need to actually make it feel easier. It would be a shortcut to getting better if I could make doing the harder thing feel like the easier thing, and yet would feel easier if I naturally felt more energized. So I said, okay, well, how do I have more energy? And that's my basic premise of this video, is that if you struggle with laziness, I've given you probably 20 or 30 minutes now of sort of philosophical underpinning of why you shouldn't be lazy and why you absolutely must shift this about yourself in your life. But that doesn't make it easy to shift. Here was my hack for actually making it easier to get less lazy at a time when I wasn't nearly as, psychologically evolved as I am now. And it was all about, I need to start doing things that create more energy than they demand. Because if I'm getting tired, it means that I'm doing things that are demanding more energy than they're creating, right? That's why thus my energy is depleting over time, and I'm reaching a point where I'm going, oh, I'm tired, so I'm going to use that as an excuse to be lazy. Ideally, I don't want to reach the point where I'm so tired that I will justify laziness until I'm actually in bed ready to fall asleep at night. It's okay to be lazy when it's actually time to go to sleep. You don't want to be lazy at any point prior to that, or else you start to compromise and chip away at your life. So I said, I need to be doing more things that create more energy than they demand, so that I'm actually adding to my reservoir throughout the day, and I can make it all the way to the end of the day without being tired and thus justifying laziness. So that was my approach anyway. So I basically identified 3 behaviors that create more energy than they require. And that is actually my prescription for how to start the process of not being so lazy while you give yourself runway for the more principles grounding approach to really get traction in your life, okay? Step 1, exercise. Exercise literally creates, it does 2 things. One, it creates energy because it revs up your metabolism and actually creates an energy boost throughout the day. And it also leads to better sleep, which means you actually recharge and replenish and wake up with more energy the next day. So exercise is something that you can start doing every single day to create an energy boost for the day, and thus reduce your temptation to be lazy at some point during the day because you say that you're tired. Obviously, diet correlates to that. What you eat has a lot to do with regulating energy. So let's actually say diet and exercise. And I have other videos that talk about the specifics of that. But this is why I work out every day. This is why I don't take days off. I know a lot of people are like, I work out 3 days a week at the gym, 4 days a week at the gym. I don't like who I am on the days I don't work out because, honestly, if I put it simply, I'm more apt to be lazy on the days that I don't work out. There's something great about getting up in the morning, working out, creating energy, stoking the furnace that'll run throughout the day, keeping it fed with the right stuff nutritionally, and then you're never so tired that you're tempted to justify laziness. Hey, sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to let you know you can get a free copy of my book, The Millionaire Shortcut, which will show you the fastest way to become a millionaire in the new economy. And there's a special link just for this episode in the description. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. The second thing you can do that creates more energy than it demands is investing in positive, constructive relationships. And on the flip side, cutting out negative relationships. Identify the 3 or 4 relationships, or even just 1 or 2, the small number of relationships in your life that actually have a positive reciprocal energy loop, where when whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it doesn't matter. Everybody's got a few relationships in their life, and if you don't, you need to go seek out different relationships. But everybody at least has the potential for relationships in their life where you have 2 parties that are aligned, they're mission congruent, and they feed each other's energy because they create resonance. It's like if you have 2 tuning forks that are vibrating at the same frequency and you put them both on the same hard surface, it'll actually more than doubly amplify the volume of the resonance, because they're vibrating when they're, not to get too technical, but when they're vibrating at the same frequency, they actually create what's called an oscillation wave that lines up to, and it has like an exponential multiplying effect on the volume of the sound. So you can literally do that same thing with relationships. When you find people that resonate and align with you, you can sort of ideologically oscillate together and amplify the energy or the volume of what you're able to do. You have to find those relationships, and you have to invest in them and only them, and you have to be pretty damn selfish about saying, screw it, I'm not interested, or at least I don't have time and I'm not willing to invest in all the other relationships in your life. In all other relationships, just do the bare minimum, get by, do what you gotta do. If you gotta go to work and deal with some people that you don't resonate with, fine, go do it, do what you gotta do. But only be investing in those really, really positive relationships that create that amplification of your energy and your value. And then the third thing is to give, to be generous. And it's funny, I've actually worked with people who they say they've never actually given because they felt like they've never had to give. It wasn't because they're horrible people, it was just they've never had surplus, right? And they've never actually given. And there's actually, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a really good TED talk about this. They would basically give people money that they could go out and then give to other people, and then they would measure their levels of happiness, they would measure their levels of productivity, they would measure different qualitative values of their life. And giving literally creates energy. It creates results. It creates efficiency. So being generous is literally something you can do that creates more energy than it demands. So that's my advice to kind of sum all that up, is those 3 things. Exercise, obviously coupled with diet, investing in the right resonant relationships, and being truly generous. Those are 3 things you can do that will increase your energy supply, which will decrease your fatigue, which will increase your fortitude in changing the habit of being lazy or just reducing laziness. We all have some amount of laziness we can reduce until, and during which time you can be sort of meditating on the philosophical reasoning and hopefully getting traction there to where it becomes like a first operating principle of your life, okay? Little different take on laziness. There's a lot of like very pragmatic how-to books. It'll teach you how to do like, set up different, cues and triggers and reward systems and rewiring habits and stuff. But I like to try to take a little different angle than maybe some of the stuff you'll read on the bookshelf. So hopefully that's helpful for you. I appreciate your time. If you're interested in more videos about how to level up all areas of your life, because how you do one thing is how you do everything, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, I would love it if you would leave it in the comments below this video. We do our best to get to every comment. Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully you are ready to not be evil, lazy, both. And I'll see you on the next video. Hey, if you liked this video, then you're gonna love this video. In this video, we're gonna talk about 3 things you can do to have more energy every single day. And I will warn you right up front, in this video, I'm not gonna be saying 3 like breakthrough pieces of new science or 3 insights that you've probably never had. I'm gonna actually be saying 3 pretty obvious things